truth. I had enough of reading things by neurotic, psychotic, gay-headed politicians. All I want is the truth. Just give me some truth.
Hello and welcome to my special podcast on Tommy Robinson. Tomorrow is the 23rd of October and Tommy Robinson is going to trial again for contempt of court, and the judge has also added 2 extra charges. I find it odd that a judge can now be prosecutor and judge in the same trial, but that's another story. But if you don't believe Tommy Robinson and the stories he's been telling, he's been trying to report the grooming gangs in our major cities for years. If you don't believe Tommy Robinson, there's a Times reporter, Andrew Norfolk, has been on this story for many years as well. Now, let's see how Andrew started. He'll explain in his own words.
On a Friday afternoon, just over 5 years ago, in August 2010, I'd taken a long weekend. I was driving through the Scottish borders en route to Edinburgh, and a news item came on the radio. A court case had just finished at Manchester Crown Court, not far from here. 9 men had been found guilty of multiple sex offences against one 14-year-old girl. She'd been befriended and then passed around these men for sex. And there was an exchange between the young reporter outside the court and the presenter in the studio in London. The presenter clearly knew as little about the case as I did, because I'd not heard anything about it until the item came on. The presenter was saying, "This sounds terrible, these are horrific offences. What was it about these 9 men? Did they know how did they know each other? Did they have anything in common?" And there was an embarrassed silence, and the young reporter sort of went, "No, I don't think there's any suggestion that these men had anything in common." Now, they hadn't named the men, and I sat there in my car, knowing nothing about the case, thinking very uneasily, I bet I know something these men have in common. This was 2010. I started on the Times in London in 2000. I moved up to Leeds in 2003 as North East correspondent, and as the years passed, I'd begun to notice what seemed to be a similarity between a number of little cases that were cropping up. Stories that would come across your desk, local newspaper reports, press agency articles. Cases where a number of men, 2 or more men, were being convicted of sex offences against girls who were almost always aged 12 to 15. The first meeting had been in a public place. It wasn't people they knew. It was a meeting in a bus station, in a shopping mall, on a street corner. And these kids, young adolescents who were wanting to be treated as more grown-up than they were, a lot of them from pretty tough backgrounds, were going through an initial befriending, grooming process, and then alcohol, drugs, being lured into a world where they were suddenly completely out of their depth. And in the worst cases, were being put into cars, taken to houses for so-called parties, and a lot of men were waiting to have sex with them. There was one other thing these cases had in common. It was very difficult to avoid noticing that the names of almost all the offenders were Muslim names. And that was really weird, because almost every form of sexual offending against children that we know in this country is overwhelmingly white men, usually acting on their own. Abuse in the family, in institutions, against boys, against prepubescent girls, online. White. But this was different, and yet each case was being treated as a one-off, totally isolated, no pattern. And that day in the car in the borders, I said to myself, when I get back to Leeds, I'm going to check. And if these 9 men are Muslim names, then finally I've got to get over my fear that this is a story it's impossible to cover because it is the far right's dream story. Innocent white girls, evil, dark-skinned men. How do you cover that? But I can't carry on ignoring it. And sure enough, when I got back, I looked up. It was indeed as I'd thought. The next day I sent a very long email to the news editor in London, said, look, I think there's something going on here. We need to look into it. Will you give me some time? And he gave me what turned out to be 3 months. Most of that time was spent trawling online, searching through newspaper, archives in local libraries, trying to find cases that fitted the pattern. Nothing to do with the names of the men who were being convicted, but the cases that fitted that model. And we came up in the end with 17 cases since the late 90s, 13 different towns and cities, 56 men convicted. 3 of the 56 were white, 53 were Asian names, 50 of them were Muslim names, and when we looked into each case, the overwhelming majority were Pakistani Muslim. Okay, so we had a kind of evidential base, but what the hell are you going to do about it? We needed to start talking to people, and so I tried to start talking to police forces, to specialists, to experts who look after children, to government departments, and there was a complete wall of silence. All we get, if anything, was a terse statement, ethnicity, culture has absolutely no relevance whatsoever to this pattern of offending. In the end, I found one small charity which worked with the families of victims, and through them I got to know some of the families and to understand that the court cases where people were actually being prosecuted were actually a tiny, tiny minority, because in most cases parents had been trying really hard to get help for their kids. They were going and knocking on doors, they were pleading with social services, with police to do something, and nothing was happening. Eventually, we were ready to publish, and we published that first story in January 2011. The whole of the front page and 4 pages inside. Within a few days, the government had ordered a national inquiry. Within 2 days, Jack Straw, the former Home Secretary, went on Newsnight and said that some young Pakistani men in his Blackburn constituency viewed white girls as easy meat, which created further headlines. I was called down to London for my very first ever one-to-one meeting with the editor of the Times. I'd been told he was quite pleased with the impact of the story, and I thought I was going to get a pat on the back and be told I'd done a good job. Instead, he told me this was now going to be my full-time job. I thought we'd done it, but he said we were going to carry on keeping running stories about this until, and he pointed from his office out through the glass surround into the newsroom, until the day comes when every single one of your colleagues arrives for work one morning, picks up the front page of the Times and says, oh my God, not another bloody story about child sexual exploitation. That's the day, he said, when I'll know we're finally starting to make a difference. You're going to carry on writing about this until we're satisfied that every public body in England has the knowledge and systems in place to protect children and prosecute offenders, however long it takes. Well, it took 4 years. We told more individual family stories. One of the very first was from a grandfather who rang from Rotherham, who wanted to talk about his granddaughter. 1 month after her 13th birthday, she'd gone to school and then gone missing, and the school had rung her mum, who'd immediately rung the police, who'd said, don't worry, love, she'll turn up as soon as she gets hungry. She didn't turn up that afternoon, that evening, and at 2:30 in the morning, the next morning, a woman on the other side of Rotherham had picked up the phone and dialed 999 because she'd heard a young girl screaming in the house next door. Police had gone round to the house. They found this 13-year-old girl with another young girl. She was almost completely naked, she was blind drunk, and she was with 7 adult Pakistani men. She was drunk and leery. And South Yorkshire Police arrested the 13-year-old girl for being drunk and disorderly. They took her back to the station, put her in the cells, eventually charged her, and she was convicted. They didn't even question the men as to why they were in a house with a 13-year-old girl who was nearly naked in the early hours of the morning.
So you see, it's not only Tommy Robinson that's reporting on these cases. It's just being denied by the mainstream media. Why? They don't want to offend what they see as a different race of people. The most heinous crime you can think of is grooming gangs roaming streets of our towns, drugging, getting drunk and raping girls. It's horrendous. Surely you've got to say, we've got to stop it. We have to stop it. Full stop. There's no argument. Don't want to offend people. Politically correct. Don't want to seem racist. What has race got to do with it? They happen to be from one ethnic group, I'd agree, but not all of them. White men rape as well. I'm also, fighting against paedophilia as well. But let's stick to Tommy Robinson, and what we're on about is grooming gangs. Now, I'd like to understand why Tommy started his campaign, and I think the best guy to explain it is Tommy himself. And this was a speech he gave to the Oxford Union.
At the same time as I talk you through this, I don't want for 1 minute for you to think I'm tarring all Muslims as bad. I'm just giving you a projected view of my life. I want you to understand the stories that have happened. I'll start with my cousin, Jeanette, or my cousin's cousin. She was sexually abused. She was groomed. It's what we now know as grooming. She was raped. She woke up one day. She was found running semi-naked from Bury Park. Bury Park is the area where a lot of the Muslims have congregated and live. It's where these 30 mosques are. She was picked up by prostitutes in the street. Her dad collected her. If I talk about the failures from the police, when the family, I want you to understand and try and picture this as though it was your family relative. When the family were going to the police, when the girl is missing for 2 days, 3 days, yeah, and there is no response, and up until the Rotherham report, people wouldn't believe these stories because they are unbelievable. They would say she's a drug addict, because in the end she was a drug addict, because she was hooked on heroin that they were giving to her. She would climb out of the bedroom window to get back to them for her fix.
So now we understand where Tommy's coming from. All Tommy's been doing is trying to educate people of what's going on and trying to stop the criminality of these grooming gangs. What's wrong with that? At least somebody's doing it. The police weren't. As Tommy said, they didn't want to seem racist. Now, the grooming gang has gone to court that Tommy was reporting on, and which Tommy is waiting to go to court tomorrow. The BBC actually reported on it for 1 day. The biggest story that's been for years. Over 20 men, convicted, and they spend 1 day on it. They reported it for 1 day. When I was working for the BBC, they would say a story would come in and it would have legs. It would run for a day, 2 days, a week, a month. It's like the Jimmy Savile story. There are so many different factions to it, it ran for months. That was a story with legs. Surely these stories about the grooming gangs should be a story that has many legs. Right. Let's see how the BBC reported the trial of the grooming gangs.
Good evening. 20 men have been found guilty of being part of a grooming gang that raped and abused girls in Huddersfield over a 7-year period. The men, mostly of Pakistani heritage, were convicted of more than 120 offences against 15 girls. The youngest of them was just 11. The girls were plied with drink and drugs, and some were abandoned on the Yorkshire moors. From Leeds Crown Court, Danny Savage reports.
A bus station. The car park of a DIY store in Huddersfield. A lonely moorland. Just a few of the places where vulnerable children were groomed and sexually abused by men of mainly Pakistani heritage. So many men were involved that 3 trials were needed. A judge has now ruled the 20 who were convicted can now be publicly identified. One of them was Muhammad Ibra, nicknamed Bully, a huge man who used his physical presence to intimidate. One of his victims was thrown out of his car when she refused to give in to his depraved demands.
He kept punching me and punching me. It felt like my nose was broken. They kicked me and I got out of the car and I started running. I jumped over the fence and I started running down the moors. Then I ran back up and then saw them drive off. I had to jump in front of a car covered in blood at 4 a.m. in the morning to get a lift back to Huddersfield.
The ringleader, Amir Singh Dhaliwal, was jailed for life and told he must serve a minimum of 18 years. The judge said his treatment of the girls was inhuman. One scenario which kept cropping up in these cases is that victims were driven up here onto the moors at night. If they didn't do what their abusers told them to, they were beaten up and dumped. Imagine being a child left in this wilderness, in the dark, having been physically and sexually assaulted by someone you thought cared for you.
Well, it's a very frightening place. There's so much moorland up here, it can be anywhere, can people.
This farmer vividly remembers distressed teenage girls knocking on the door of his remote hilltop home. Over the years, he's had to take several to safety.
As I looked out, there were three girls. Obviously looked roughed up and confused. They didn't know where they were and they asked, can they come in and could I help them?
And what was the impression you got of what had happened to them?
It looked like they'd been knocked about with somebody. Yeah, something funny, something very suspicious had been happening. And I could tell by the hair it was everywhere and they were just uncontrollable crying.
She would come home disorientated, scratches, bites.
The mother of one schoolgirl victim told us what everyday life was like.
On one occasion she came home and her neck was completely black with bites from one side to the other. A taxi had just pulled up outside and pushed her out. I could see another girl in the back and then it just drove off. I changed my hours so I could pick her up after school. I used to dread bank holidays when I knew she was going to be at home and I couldn't monitor her.
Victims and their families said they repeatedly told West Yorkshire Police what was happening here, but no arrests were made until years later. Today the force refused to answer criticism from the prosecution that their conduct was disgraceful. The local council says it all happened when child sexual exploitation was effectively ignored.
These crimes took place a number of years ago, at a time when, as we know sadly from other cases in other parts of the country, that the issue of child sexual exploitation was not well defined or understood. Since then, lessons have been learned.
Most of the men so far sentenced for this litany of abuse have each been jailed for at least 15 years. Another 4 defendants will be sentenced next month. Danny Savage, BBC News, West Yorkshire.
Now we know how the news spin stories. What they do is they have the factual reporting and then they have a reporter or editor to explain the story to the listener. Now, the reporter doesn't say anything wrong, but you've got to remember that the BBC has not reported this at all. And if they reported anything on Tommy Robinson, it's been very negative. He's a far right-wing extremist. Well, I've got no proof of that at all. It just seems to be a guy who's trying to save the kids from being raped. Now, BBC, if you know the backstory to all this, this is the spin. This is the, oh, we knew all about it, oh, we were the only ones, we've now got to report it. Let's see how the BBC explain it. Now, it was only said once on the 10 o'clock news, and it was never repeated. The next day on there wasn't a word on the BBC.
And our home editor, Mark Easton, is with me. And what is so desperate, Mark, listening to that, is that we have seen cases similar to this over the last few years.
Rotherham, Oxford, Rochdale, Derby, Banbury, Telford, Peterborough, Aylesbury, Bristol, Halifax, Keighley, Newcastle, Huddersfield. This is a familiar scandal, the sexual abuse of vulnerable children in English towns by groups of men of predominantly Pakistani heritage, but others too. It went on for decades, but only really in the last 5, 6, 7 years have people taken proper notice. Indeed, it's a crime that until recently we've rarely discussed in public. Child sexual abuse is often ignored or covered up. The protection of institutional reputations or the protection of community cohesion has been put before the protection of children. The grooming gangs of provincial England have tended to operate where the disinfectant of public scrutiny fails to reach poorer neighbourhoods on the edge of town, around the minicab ranks and the fast food joints, the twilight zones of urban life. And child abuse thrives in dark corners where people look the other way or don't ask difficult questions. But when we do look, we find schoolmasters and care workers, priests and TV presenters, shopkeepers and minicab drivers. When we look, we find. And the only crumb of comfort from this deeply painful process is that by exposing the canker at the heart of our society, we so belatedly are making our children hopefully a little bit safer.
Mark, thank you. Mark Easton.
So, as you see, the spin doctors at the BBC try to dig themselves out of a hole. They haven't been reporting on this at all. It is almost as if we're the only ones that can give you the news. I'm going to leave the last word in a minute to Tommy. Tommy will explain it in his own inimitable style. But it's important that we all realise that freedom of speech is at stake. It's the powers that be, the government, the police, the deep state, if you want to call it that, want to control what we can say, how we can say it. And Tommy Robinson is a free agent. He's not linked to any group or any business. He says it as he sees it. And I think he's been telling the truth. Now, you can't get over the truth is the truth. Voltaire said that I may disagree with what you say, but I'll fight to the death your right to say it. And that's what all journalists should be doing, is standing up and fighting for the right for Tommy to have a free say. He can't slander anybody. He can't tell lies. We have laws in place. If you slander somebody or you libel somebody, you can be prosecuted. So there's safeguards in place. But you must maintain free speech. This country is dead if we haven't got free speech. They tell us we got free speech. But what we've done is we've signed up to the European Court of Human Rights. And it's called freedom of expression. Well, freedom of expression is not free speech. That has even more restrictions on it. We have got to maintain the British right of free speech. We all know what it is. It's common law. And the common law is free speech. You can speak your mind as long as the truth as you know it. As long as you don't slander or libel anybody. And that's it. It's as simple as that. Tommy, I'm going to leave the last word to you, and good luck tomorrow, and I hope you are allowed to walk from court a free man.
Barnet. God, it's warm in here, man. So, just thought I'd take the opportunity to respond to some of the articles that are out there. I've seen The Guardian, I've seen the Metro, I've seen the Standard, I've seen the Independent. All of them running articles of how Tommy Robinson should apologise to the victims of the Huddersfield grooming gang. That's right, I should apologise to the victims. Do you know what I do? I apologise to every one of them. I apologise to them for the fact that Britain allowed this to happen to them. I apologise to them for the fact that the police done nothing, even when they were beaten, battered and bruised after being raped in the moors, in fields. The police still didn't press charges. I apologise for the fact that the girls' mums phoned and begged and cried themselves to sleep nightly, asking and begging for the people in positions of power. In our country, we have a system where when there's vulnerable children, people in positions of the council, of social services, of the police are supposed to be there to protect them. So yes, I apologise that our country wholeheartedly let you down. If you notice now, the point I was making with these trials, if there wasn't a reporting restriction for the last 12 months, bearing in mind they've lifted it, they weren't going to lift it. They weren't willingly lifting it. They lifted it after a challenge by the media. A challenge that the media decided not to do 12 months ago. Okay, they were quite happy not reporting on any of these crimes until the end. What you've seen now is when the verdicts have come out, when they're allowed to report it, 1 day's news. 1 day's news. Okay, and now all of them they've already had enough of reporting on what happened to these girls. Now it's bash Tommy Robinson with this story. They talk about me trying to politicise and use gain of these trials. Look at them. 1 day they've given, one evening of news, and then it's Tommy Robinson could have collapsed this trial. Now, just for all of those reporters, for Piers Morgan, for all of those alike who are messaging this to say, look, he risked the trial. The court transcripts of the judge and the CPS both state nothing Tommy Robinson said could have caused prejudice to the trial. That means, for all you retards out there, that I didn't and couldn't have prejudiced the trial, because all I said was what was already in the public domain. I made sure of that. I didn't assume guilt. I made sure of that. I made sure that everything, I went on my training course at one of London's top law firms for contempt of court. I made sure I stuck by those guidelines. Now, am I sorry? More people, after me being imprisoned, yeah, it was crap, but more people than ever across this world are watching and reading and listening about Muslim rape squads that have been targeting our daughters. More people than ever. And I'm sweating in the swimming pool. But so I just thought I'd clear up, and it's so obvious to look. It's so obvious. Just look, just search now. Tommy Robinson, Huddersfield. You'll find all the hit pieces, all of them coming out together, all the journalists, everyone with a blue tick, basically, coming out together saying, oh, look, he could have destroyed it. No. And all of these people, Lizzie Dearden, one of the people who runs a story, she runs a story about me, saying how I could have jeopardised this trial. In the court transcripts for my trial, which I've got, which I'll be producing as evidence on Tuesday, in the court transcripts, Lizzie Dearden, the same journalist writing the hit piece on me now, is named as breaching 2 reporting restrictions for the same case, the same weekend. The only difference is Lizzie Dearden is very politically correct, won't mention at all the cause of this or the reasoning why these men have these misogynistic and sexist views. Nothing, of course, to do with their religious beliefs. Nothing at all. Lizzie Dearden won't mention any of this. So Lizzie Dearden gets away with it. She doesn't get hauled behind before the court or put in prison. Because I'll tell you why. Because Lizzie Dearden, unfortunately for you, Lizzie, only a maximum of about 30,000 people read your news, The Independent. I think your maximum readership is 50,000. So, of course, the government don't give a shit about you when you report all of their little toxic thing. The difference is when I do a live stream, like this one, it will end up going to hundreds of thousands, if not eventually millions of people. Which is why they want to shut me down, not you. They're not bothered about you. You play the mainstream line. You play the line that, this could be anyone and there's no problem here. It's got nothing to do with Islam. It's nothing to do with them. Whereas the reality is very different. The British public are waking up to that thanks to our own platforms. So how long we have these platforms for, I don't know. But I just thought I'd clear up all of these articles I'm reading. I'm seeing MPs. MPs are now coming out. Check this. MPs are now coming out saying how I must apologise. In this Huddersfield grooming case, it turns out that one of the victims wrote to the Prime Minister, one of the victims' mums, begging for help. One of the other victims went to her MP. So her MP knew. Her MP knew about these rapes and gangs before any of them were prosecuted. What did he do? Do any of you lot remember seeing him screaming on TV? Do any of you lot remember seeing any of these people talk about it? Any of these people? Or were they all happy to let these young girls be sacrificed at the hand of multiculturalism and the altar of diversity in our country? Anyway, I'm going to get back in the swimming pool.